We're going to spend some time now looking at the greases. Now, in your syllabus, I've mentioned to you that you ought to be thinking about the research paper you're going to write at the end of the semester. You haven't had a chance to look at any of the novels other than the three we've dealt with so far, but your research paper can be on any of the novels in this course. I want to remind you about that. The 28th, I'd like to get a card from you that just tells me what book you think you'd like to focus on, but don't omit consideration of some of the later books. Weidman's novel of the urban ghetto, McMurtry's Western novel, Leaving Cheyenne, Gertrude Stein's minimalist novel, Ida. These are very interesting books that you may want to spend some time with. Or if you like Melville, you can continue with that. I just found an insect. It looks like a little termite. It was on my paper. Maybe I can put it under here, but I would have killed it if it hadn't been for Uncle Toby. Now here it is. Can we have that under the light there? You see that? There it is. So I'll just let it go by itself and live. Room enough in the world for everyone. See, we learn, and we've got to benefit from our learning and put it into practice. It's not enough just to learn, you've got to do it.
Dr. Rothman?
Yes.
I'm at West Houston, and if we have to turn that card into you, do we need to have the courier send it over then for Tuesday?
No, I don't think it's that. There's no deadline on that. You can give it to the West Houston people next week, and they can send it by courier, or you can put it on the back of a postcard and mail it to me.
And also, if we decide to change our book later on, if maybe we get into another book, can we do that?
That's fair, because each book will absorb your interest in different ways. Then March 7th, I do want you to do a data search. Now, our library has a number of databases, and you can search it. You can search the databases to find any number of articles that may help you get insight into the novel you're going to research. Now, this is one of the reasons why I wanted an early notification, because the data search will help you see what we have in our library and what we don't have in our library. And if there are books or articles in the data search that we don't have, then you can place an early order for them through interlibrary loan. Our interlibrary loan department is very efficient, but sometimes it takes 2 weeks and 3 weeks to get some materials. And that's the only disadvantage in choosing a work much later. The truth of the matter is that with some of the later books, McMurtry, Weidman, and Gertrude Stein, there is not a lot of material to research, so that you wouldn't have to go very far afield. But what I want you to do really is to get a head start on some of this, start anticipating what topics you might want to deal with. And if you read the novel and questions arise, then you can look for those articles that might help you gain some interest in your topic. By the way, let me say this, that it's far more important for you to read the book and then pick out, as I'm going to do in a few moments, the greases to give you some idea of topics you can focus on, than to go to the critics first. The critics in some ways are very good, but they'll also force your opinion for you. Now, in some cases, you'll be able to read a book and come out with, you'll be able to write 4 or 5 pages just off the top of your head on the basis of your own reading. And then the critics can be used to help flesh out your argument or help turn your argument. But be very careful that you don't destroy your own capability for judgment by reading critics who will shape your judgment before you have a chance to come to your own decisions. So the way I'd like you to do this is to pick a work that you really want to research, spend some time reading it. Your data search will help you focus on the topics and the directions in which you must go. And then an early data search will help you discover what items we have and which items we don't have, so that you can search them and ask the interlibrary loan to order them for you. At any rate, send me a card at some point so I know what topic you're going to focus on. Then conduct your data search to give you some idea where you can go and what people have already said about the subject. And then from that point on, you can start exploring the subject. Well, let's explore Tristram Shandy. And first I'd like to look at the issue of government. Now, we've already talked about that under government you have agreements made. And the premarital agreement effected by Mrs. Shandy under the name of Elizabeth Molyneux, we've already talked about. The terms of that settlement are quite formidable. And you can get some idea of what the law requires of a woman and of a husband. We discover that a certain amount of money is going to be paid to lawyers. We discover that £120 is going to be paid into the hands of Elizabeth Molyneux for hiring of one coach to carry and convey her and the child or children with which she is pregnant to London. So there is an agreement about how much money this coach is going to cost and what kind of coach it shall be. We discover that Walter Shandy is going to give certain presents in point of law, certain pieces of property he's going to have available. We discover that the manor and lordship of Shandy, the house, buildings, barns, stables, orchards, gardens, backsides, tofts, crofts, garths, cottages, lands, meadows, feedings, pastures, marshes are part of the property of the Shandy estate. And we get some idea of what her environs will be, what her home will be like, what her privileges will be, what limitations she will have on her being, to the extent to which she will create heirs for Walter Shandy. All this is part of government. And the way one governs one's home, presumably, is as fair and as honest as the governance of a family. Now, women have rights in the 18th century. A woman who comes to a family with an estate understands, as the husband understands, that if they have a male heir, the estate will pass on to the male heir. If they do not have a male heir, the estate in many instances will return and revert to her family for the closest relative to have a male successor to keep the family to keep the estate in the family line. The husband who takes over an estate doesn't own the estate unless a male heir comes into the family, but he does obtain rents and he does obtain benefits from having possession of this land. If the husband should die and the woman stays, she has rights to maintain his property. In many cases, women ran property and owned property and managed property in the 18th century. So we don't want to think that Mrs. Shandy is totally disinherited or doesn't have certain rights. The death of Bobby, of course, becomes a disaster because Bobby was the male heir who is to receive these entitlements. And then it must pass on to Tristram, for whom tragedies always occur and whose estate may not be as certain as a Bobby's was. Let's look at page 33, where Walter objects to being in the city. Why does he object to the city? He was very sensible that all political writers upon the subject had unanimously agreed and lamented from the beginning of Queen Elizabeth's reign down to his own time that the current of men and money towards the metropolis upon one frivolous errand or another set in so strong as to become dangerous to our civil rights. Though, by the by, a current was not the image he took the most delight in, a distemper was here his favorite metaphor. And he claimed that the city was a danger to people. People came to the city and they entered into frivolous affairs. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says there are certain occupations in a city that one doesn't find in the country. What are they? Stevedores, bellhops, what else? Certainly in a city you're going to find tattoo parlors. You may find body houses that you wouldn't find in the country. You may find houses of ill repute and houses of pleasure that are going to destroy you. Remember Wordsworth in his later poem, Michael, has Michael create this farm for his son. His son goes into the city and is somehow corrupted by the city and sails far off, so Michael never sees his son again, and his land and farm goes into ruins. The city is a place of corruption. This is one of the reasons why your relatives hated to see you come to Houston. They're sure that the piety of the city and the piety of the country and the fellowship of close relatives would be undermined by the dissolute nature of the city, by its corruption, by gangs, by such frivolous arts as opera, theater, and symphony. So we have Walter's objection to the city, and then Walter's attitude to the degradation of male power. He's worried also that the way things are going in this world, men aren't going to be able to rule the way they once did. If you look on page 34, we get this statement. Another political reason which prompted my father so strongly to guard against the least evil accident of my mother's lying in the country was that any such instance would infallibly throw a balance of power, too great already, into the weaker vessels of the gentry in his own or higher stations, which, with the many other usurped rights which that part of the Constitution was hourly establishing, would in the end prove fatal to the monarchical system of domestic government established in the first creation of things by God. So therefore, the laws that are being passed, the liberal laws of the city, the liberalization of marriage laws, the liberalization of divorce laws, the authority that the woman imposed upon the husband by writing marriage contracts that allowed her to go into the city, all these were devices intended to weaken the Constitution and to reduce the world as it had been conceived by God under the bishops and the church and the country gentry who ruled by law, by vote, and by land tenure and primogeniture. So that the government is under fire. Now let's turn to the next subject under the Greases. Now, any of these subjects, of course, is a subject that you could develop in your own research paper if you wanted to focus on how a single writer has chosen to deal with a subject of some moment. Now, under the subject of religion, we found on page 37 that oratory is the gift of God. This is on Volume 1, Chapter 19. On page 37. As we're dealing with oratory and moving on to sermons, we discover that Walter Shandy is capable of delivering sermons. I never knew a man able to answer this argument, but indeed to speak of my father as he was certainly irresistible, both in his orations and disputations. He was born an orator. Theodidactos. Persuasion hung upon his lips, and the elements of logic and rhetoric were so blended up in him, and withal he had so shrewd a guess at the weaknesses and passions of his respondent, that nature might have stood up and said, "This man is eloquent." Remember from Julius Caesar, nature might have stood up and said that this is a man. This man is eloquent. In short, whether he was on the weak or the strong side of the question, 'twas hazardous in either case to attack him. And yet 'tis strange he had never read Cicero nor Quintilian de Oratore. So he had the ability to orate, and this came as a gift of God. Religion is discussed in Trim's Sermon on Conscience and Morality, which is in Volume 2, Chapter 17, pages 91 to 98. And of course, what Trim is doing there is reciting Stern's own sermon that Stern himself had given in church. The discussion has to do with the difference between honor and conscience, and how one maintains one's conscience. Look at the bottom of page 91. I own in one case, says Trim, whenever a man's conscience does accuse him, he is guilty. That is, whatever you do, if you yourself know that there is a fault, if you yourself know you've done the wrong thing, then your conscience makes you guilty, no matter what anyone else says. This is a religious point of view. But the converse of the proposition will not hold true. Namely, that whenever there is guilt, the conscience must accuse. And if it does not, a man is therefore innocent. This is not a fact. So that the common consolation which some good Christian or other is hourly administering to himself, that he thanks God his mind does not misgive him, and that consequently he has a good conscience because he is a quiet one, is fallacious. In other words, whatever you do, if you think and can rationalize away the act you've performed, you may still have your conscience to answer to, because God is alone responsible for making these judgments. A man shall be vicious and utterly debauched in his principles, exceptionable in his conduct to the world, shall live shameless in the open commission of a sin which no reason or pretense can justify, a sin by which, contrary to all the workings of humanity, he shall ruin forever the deluded partner of his guilt, rob her of her best dowry, and not only cover her own head with dishonor, but involve a whole virtuous family in shame and sorrow for her sake. Surely you will think conscience must lead such a man a troublesome life. He can have no rest night or day from its reproaches. Alas, conscience had something else to do all this time than break in upon him. There are some people in this world whose conscience will not bother them when they injure their family, harm their wives, abuse their families. But at some point, there will be some recognition. And we find that human nature allows some people to act without conscience and some people to act without honor. But at some point, there will be an answer that must be given. Another is sordid and unmerciful. Here Trim waved his right hand. A straight-hearted, selfish wretch, incapable either of private friendship or public spirit. Take notice how he passes by the widow and orphan in their distress and sees all the miseries incident to human life without a sigh or prayer. Shall not conscience rise up and sting him on such occasions? No. Thank God there is no occasion. I pay every man his own, says the Lord. I have no fornication to answer to my conscience, no faithless vows or promises to make up. I debauch no man's wife or child, thank God. I'm not as other men, adulterers, unjust, or even as this libertine who stands before me. In other words, conscience, says Trim, responds ultimately, not immediately, and not to those who don't own it. But when old age comes on and repentance calls him to look back upon this black account and state it over again with his conscience, conscience looks into the statutes at large. And says Trim in this discussion, sometimes the conscience will be overwhelmed by the law. Sometimes the letter of the law will allow people to get away without bothering their conscience. But in the end, conscience will monitor and will be placed on high as a judge within us, intended by our Maker as a just and equitable one. Now, it's a very complex discussion here, because what Trim is saying is that there are people in this world who will not see it until much later. And so we can't immediately justify or not justify condemnation. A person's conscience and his belief will ultimately bring its just due. Then we get various differences. There are differences, says the sermon, between Protestants who maintain but two sacraments, Holy Communion and baptism, and Catholics who have 7 sacraments: the Eucharist, baptism, confirmation, marriage, penance, extreme unction, and holy orders. Put the N where it belongs. Look at page 174. God's pleasure in creation. What does Tristram Shandy tell us about religion there? Why, this is before the discussion of Slockenbergius' tale, why is one man's nose longer than another's? No other reason but because God pleases it to be so. And if, obviously, by the same token, if the deity pleases something to happen, then no man should be responsible for criticizing it, because that's the way things are. You can draw that any analogy you want. Let's just take that phrase. Why is one man's nose longer than another? because God pleases it so. How would you address that analogy and expand it? You could say, why are people of one race or another? That's the way the world is. And the decision is made by higher powers than we are. Why are there earthquakes in California, snowstorms in Nebraska, hurricanes in Texas, tornadoes in Florida? Put your answer down, and then you won't be complaining about the weather, right? When you complain about the weather, you're trying to complain about something that presumably is ordained by forces over which you have no control. God's pleasures in creation. Now, there is a problem, though. Let's look at page 343, where we get a statement about the nature of modern belief. And if you go through Tristram Shandy, looking for the aphorisms and the ideas that enrich this text, you'll see some of the problems that exist in this world. The world may not allow religious belief so much as it may allow irreligious belief, so much as it may allow dissolute belief and sinning, says Tristram on page 343. But your worships choose, rather, that I give you the length, the breadth, the perpendicular height of the great parish church, or a drawing of the facade of the Abbey of St. Austerbert, which has been transported from Artois hither. Everything is just, I suppose, as the masons and carpenters left them years and years ago when people really believed. And if the belief in Christ continues so long, will be so those 50 years to come. So he's saying, I hope people still believe today, but I'm not going to really push it more than 50 years. He says, what happens after 50 years, I'm not going to promise you. But hopefully, at least for 50 more years, people will believe in religion. And to this extent, the nature of modern belief is such that people are becoming irreligious, they're becoming heretics, they're becoming hypocrites, they're becoming disbelievers, they're becoming latitudinarians, they're becoming, goodness sakes, in the 18th century, they might even become so heretical and so hypocritical as to become Methodists. The Methodists in the 18th century, as you well know, were persecuted by the Anglican Church, and areas that had been vacated by the Church in the prisons and the brothels, the Methodists chose to minister to. A few more points on religion. Again, the fate of the world. Can we look at the sheet? Bohemia has no seaports, but might have had it pleased God. That is, whatever happens in the world would have been a decision made higher up. We know that King William has certain views on predestination. The nurse ministers to Trim for love of Trim and for love of her Christ. 415 is a problem. There's the marriage of Christian and pagan gods. Both, however, at some point give a sense of a religious response. In volume 8, chapter 34 and page 418, at a point when we are becoming very much involved in the lovemaking of the widow Wadman and Uncle Toby, hopefully this love is for pure religious purposes and not simply for lascivious and lustful purposes. And says Tristram, we must be protected from the evil one even particularly in lovemaking. Uncle, we have a novitiate in the church at volume 723 who is concerned about protecting her virginity. And then on page 357, we realize that a lot of responses in religion and lovemaking are casuistical. That is, people who have certain rules and people who have moral laws are likely to reshape their principles and reshape their moral laws depending on particular circumstances. And all of these discussions really become part of Tristram Shandy. Tristram Shandy becomes a book which, in fact, can become a compendium, really a Tristopedia of the thought and culture of the 18th century. But more important than that, the thought and culture of the Enlightenment, of which we are the immediate heirs. That is, when you talk about the 18th century, you're talking about changes in religious toleration, changes in religious ferment, changes in Enlightenment politics that emerge from this period. At the time at which the novel was written, there was a great deal of prejudice. In 1753, there was a bill that was brought into Parliament to give Jews citizenship. And it was so violently opposed that it was just dropped. Later on, there were bills to give Roman Catholic citizenship in the 1790s, and there were riots. But in the first decades of the 19th century already, the Enlightenment had reached points of toleration where citizenship was given to people in religions other than the Protestant religion in England, and we are moving into the modern period, even though violent acts of religious intolerance in the 20th century suggest that there are still pockets of resistance to the Enlightenment. Let's move on to another topic, economics in the 18th century, as we find in Tristram Shandy. And can we look at the map now to get this? Thank you. Economics. I'd mentioned to you already the relationship between political responsibility and economic control. As the city takes over and as institutional economics gives strength to urban cultures, as landlords find people demanding their own land, and we find that as long as the politicians can control the land and control the people, and control the economics, they maintain power. But when the power becomes, when the middle class gains its strength, when the large landholders find their lands breaking up, divided, either because they can't pay the rents or because social issues are moving toward land division, then individuals lose control. And we find that a point of discussion on page 35 in Tristram Shandy. Page 158, volume 3, chapter 31, we discover that income can be settled upon a widow. Women have a right, and women have a claim to funds when their husband dies, or when the husband dies, to make them secure. We find on the Grand Tour, which is a great chapter, the whole book 7 is the Grand Tour through Europe, which Tristram takes, and we get insight into all the kinds of cities, the different cultures in which Tristram confronts. Of course, all of this, the Grand Tour, which he's supposed to enjoy for his education, dissipates into his love of a peasant girl, and that whole episode becomes a digression and diversion from the educational tour that Tristram is taking. But for example, look at pages 347 to 348. He discovers he's got to pay for the stagecoach. Even if he doesn't take it to the end of the line, he's got to pay the taxes. On page 347, he says, yet the incessant returns of paying for the horses at every stage, with the necessity thereupon of putting your hand into your pocket and counting out from thence 3 livres, 15 sous, sou by sou, puts an end to so much of the project that you cannot execute above 6 miles of it, were it to save your soul from destruction. I'll be even with them, quote I, for I'll put the precise sum into a piece of paper and hold it ready in my hand all the way. Now I shall have nothing to do, said I, composing myself to rest, but to drop this gently into the postboy's hat and not say a word. That is, this is how he'll pay. He'll anticipate what he's supposed to pay. But then there wants 2 sous more to drink. He forgot that he wanted some refreshments. Or there's a 12 sou piece of Louis XIV, which will not pass. But in heaven, you've paid but for a single post. You've only gone part of the way, and now you have to pay more. Whereas you've paid but a single post, whereas 'tis a post and a half you go. And this obliges you to pull out your book of post roads, the print of which is so very small it forces you to open your eyes whether you will or no. And then Monsieur le Curé offers you a pinch of snuff, or a poor soldier shows you his leg, or a shaveling his box, or the priestess of the cistern will water your wheels. They do not want it, but you've got to pay them. But the postilion, first affirming and then persisting in it to my face that there was no mark upon the 2 sou piece. He doesn't like the money you got. It's counterfeit. So you've got to come up with more money. And pretty soon, the whole trip becomes jaded by the fact that you have an obligation to pay, to tip, to buy meals, to buy drinks, until the economy of the trip outweighs the pleasure of the trip. And at 349, we find out some of the amazing things he discovers when he comes into the city and realizes the economy of the city. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 cooks' shops. Walk through New York City. One of the things that amazes you is the number of places to eat. San Francisco, the number of places to eat within a walking distance. San Antonio, how many places you can eat at just in a walking distance. These are big cities. What else is there? Twice the number of barbers, and all within 3 minutes driving. One would think that all the cooks in the world, on some great merry meeting with the barbers, by joint consent had said, "Come, let us all go live in Paris." Well, the city has a certain attraction. There's nothing you can get in the city. People who come from New York don't like Houston. They say, we close up at midnight. They can go 24 hours a day. There's always something there. I think we've got some 24-hour places now, right? What's open 24 hours a night?
Kinko's.
Kinko's and a IHOP, right? So you can buy yourself papers and you can eat for 24 hours now, but that's only recently. So that book 7, by the way, of Tristram Shandy, I think is really a very inventive book, because you're going through all the cities of Europe, you're taking this tour, and then you're finding him interrupting again all the trips toward Europe. And on pages 350 to 51, the streets. He looks at a map, and he looks at the streets in Paris. In the quarter called the City, there are 53 streets. In St. James of the Shambles, 55 streets. In St. Opportune, 34 streets. In the quarter of the Louvre, 25 streets. In the Palace Royal of St. Honorius, 49 streets. In Montmartre, 41 streets. In St. Eustace, 29 streets. In the Halles, 27 streets. In the 4th Ward, 28 streets where you're going to look up votes. In Meyerland, 53 streets where you're going to look up votes. In University Place, 100 new homes going up. You see, this is what the travel is. You become aware that in this world, a lot of things are happening that you see nowhere else. By the way, one of the barbers that Tristram mentions in this book, as he's describing self-inflicted wounds or wounds, is a fellow by the name of Ambroise Paré, P-A-R-E. Ambroise Paré, I'll give you his exact dates. I should have them on the top of my head, but I don't. He's considered the father of Western surgery. He lived in the year 1520. He was 15 years old in the year 1525. He's mentioned it. This is one of the enjoyable things about reading Tristram Shandy. You come across names, if you begin investigating them, you'll become amazed. Ambroise Paré was 15 years old when he first saw some beggars in the city, and he saw a beggar with a withered arm, and he felt so sorry for the man that he was going to give him some money for charity, until by some quirk of fate, the hand fell out of the sleeve. And the police arrested the beggar for panhandling and for fraud because the man had taken the arm from a corpse and had stuck it up in his arm and pretended that he had a withered arm so he could collect charity. And Ambroise Paré was first of all interested in the man's arm, and then later on became a battlefield surgeon. By the way, a lot of good inventions occur, medical inventions occur on the battlefield where people have to expedite cures for people who are wounded. But on the battlefield, it used to be a soldier's leg would be amputated, and the healing process was a very, very long process and a very debilitating process. But Ambroise Paré came up with a technique for burning or suturing the ends of the nerves at amputations in such a way that he reduced the scar tissue and improved the healing process. So when you come across the name of Ambroise Paré in this book, Latinized, and go to the French Ambroise Paré, you can find a very nice, you can make yourself familiar with Ambroise Paré. There was a very interesting article on Ambroise Paré in a French magazine called Top Santé in December of '92. And copyright laws don't allow me to put it under the veil. But here's a whole chapter on surgery born thanks to the barbers. And in the 18th century, the barbers' union and the surgeons' union split. They had been together. The barbers and surgeons' union was one. In the 18th century, the surgeons finally concluded that there were too many barbers sitting on their board who didn't know anything about surgery. By the way, surgeons in the 18th century were hacks. Right? They weren't doctors. Doctors were refined people capable of balancing body chemistry. Surgeons used saws to cut off legs and limbs, and they had no anesthesia, so it was a very painful, difficult process. At any rate, Tristram and Laurence Sterne are very familiar with the work and the culture of Ambroise Paré, and when you begin studying all the various avenues, all the digressions that you find in Tristram Shandy, you have the opportunity to study the culture and the history, scientific invention, and physiology. I'm not going to have time tonight to move on to much more, but just let's look at the pad one more time at this point on science and engineering. We have, of course, the way Bobby emerges correctly from the womb. We have Trim and Bridget making love on the fortifications and destroying the bridge. We do get, in volume 38, some elements about techniques for grafting the skin. We do discover that in volume 5, chapter 20, page 265, that Trim, who is the guiding light behind the establishment of these fortifications, discovers that he needs extra rope and lead to make some cannon. And so he strips the house of all the sash. He strips it of all its lead weights so he can melt the lead into cannon. And he uses it on these fortifications. The nurse, of course, takes Tristram to the window as a youngster to urinate out of it because the chamber pot is missing. And as he is there, because there are no sashes for the windows and no weights, the window comes down on Tristram and he is unceremoniously circumcised. At this point, the maid runs out of the house hysterical. Dr. Slop runs to take care of Tristram, who has obviously been not mortally wounded, but wounded. Had this been done by ceremony, there would have been no wound. It would have been a religious event. But being done in this manner, and throughout Tristram Shandy, we have the problem with what happens to people who are wounded in the groin area, from Uncle Toby to Tristram. At this point, of course, Walter Shandy now realizes his son's name has been ruined, his nose has been ruined, and then his penis has also been injured, to the extent where Walter, we find, now lamenting the fact that how many lashes must he bear, and we come back to our original discussion. Now, we also move into the discussion in volume 8, chapter 22, page 402, where there is the argument between the knee and the groin injuries, and Toby Shandy assures Trim that even if his knee had been shattered in 1,000 places, it would not be as damaged as he himself was damaged when he was damaged in the groin. I'd like to move now, and we're not going to have time to get to Ivanhoe tonight because there are just so many things that we want to get into. And I haven't given anyone here a real chance to talk tonight. But, okay, there are some very interesting digressions. Now, what happens, of course, in Tristram Shandy, and it's almost as much of a pleasure to read Tristram Shandy for the digressions as to read it for its plot. By the way, those of you who like to read Herman Melville, when you read Redburn, the plot is not as important as the philosophical passages. And when you read Melville's Moby Dick, which we're not reading for this class, you can almost read the philosophical chapters on the tri-works and the lifeline and the line, which seem very much more impressive than the story plot itself. And I think you find in the digressions of Tristram Shandy, you find this too. So let's look at volume 1, page 53, where we discuss Momus. And while I'm reading this, you can, the booth can keep its self-focused on the sheets so members of the class can copy what I have there. On 23, we have the issue on Momus. I'm sorry, page 53. We have this statement. If the fixture of Momus's glass in the human breast had taken place, first, the very wisest, the very gravest of us all, in one coin of other, must have paid window money every day of our lives. Now, what is this issue? Momus, you know, tells you, is a Greek figure who personifies mockery. He criticizes Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the workman god of the anvil, for not fitting a window into the breast of a mortal human being so you could see what people really thought. So says Tristram, if man had been created with a window in his breast so that you could see what was there, it would be worth paying for every day of your life to see what people really thought. Second, had the glass been set up, nothing more would have been wanting in order to have taken a man's character, but to have taken a chair and gone softly to view the soul stark naked, observed all her motions, the soul is female, her machinations, traced all her maggots from their first engendering to their crawling forth, watched her loose in her frisks if she gets involved in salacious moves and sexual ideas, watched her gambols, her capricios, and after some notice of her more solemn deportment, consequent upon such frisks, then taken your pen and ink and set down nothing but what you had seen and could have sworn to. If you could just see through this window what the soul of man is really like, how serious he can be and how frivolous he can be, how serious a soul can be, how frivolous she can be, then you wouldn't have to dream up anything when you wrote. You could just write your own novel from your sense of what people really felt. Let's move on to perhaps one most famous. There are two digressions I'd like to talk about. One is Slockenbergius's tale, and the other is the tale of Lefevre. In Slockenbergius's tale, we have a man coming to town who has a prodigious nose. He says he comes from the promontory of noses. And because noses suggest prowess, power, potential, everyone in town then becomes enamored of this nose and wants the nose on his terms. You turn to volume 4, which is entirely attached to Slockenbergius's tale. Well, everyone becomes embraced with this, fascinated with this nose. While the stranger was discussing where he came from, people are commenting upon it. "'Tis an imposture, my dear," said the master of the inn. "'Tis a false nose." "'Tis a true nose," said his wife. "'Tis made of fir tree," said he. "I smell the turpentine." "There's a pimple on it," said she. "It's true." "'Tis a dead nose," replied the innkeeper. "'Tis a live nose, and if I am alive myself," said the innkeeper's wife, "I will touch it." "It shall never be touched," said the stranger, clasping his hands and bringing them close to his breast. "Till that hour." "What hour?" cried the innkeeper's wife. "Never, never," said the stranger. "Never till I am got." "For heaven's sake, into what place?" said she. The stranger rode away without ever saying a word. But others are interested in this nose. One is the Abbess of Quedling Bird, who, with the 4 great dignitaries of her chapter, the prioress, the deaness, the subchantress, and the senior canoness, are fascinated with this nose. And they go to bed fascinated with the nose. They can't sleep fascinated with the nose. They are agitated, fascinated with the nose. They're trying to decide. They're trying to decide what size and strength this nose could be, how large it could be, whether it's sufficient for a single man. And the whole stream of discourse, we discover, is a dialectical argument on what this nose does. Every soul, good and bad, rich and poor, learned and unlearned. Notice the dialectical opposites. Good and bad, this is on page 184. Good and bad, rich and poor, learned and unlearned, doctor and student, mistress and maid, gentle and simple, nun's flesh and women's flesh. In Strasbourg, they all spent their time, and every finger, every thumb in Strasbourg burned to touch it. Well, obviously, the Slockenburgis's noise, Slockenburgis's nose makes a lot of noise in town, and the equation is made with human power, potential, and sexuality. And in the 18th century and throughout this novel, the nose is equated with the penis, and the phallocentric imagery of the nose suggests that all women are concerned with the sexuality and the prowess of their men. All men are determined to make sure that they are not reduced, they are not emasculated, that they in fact have the power to create, to engender, to love, to generate, and to sustain future generations. By the same token, there is enough of play in the novel. Even Tristram, when he sees where his young lady has gone to school, he's fascinated with the city of Amiens, because this woman whom he saw in another town had gone to school at Amiens, and therefore his mind saw her when he should have been thinking about more serious matters. He remembers her. He travels to this town where he sees and remembers she had come from, and so his whole trip through Europe is somewhat shaped by the women he meets and the women whom he then chooses to love in his memory, if not in person. The Slockenburgis's tale is one long body joke. And to some, Tristram Shandy itself is one long body joke, because Sterne uses every opportunity, every device, every allusion to either comment upon, romanticize, or joke about the human anatomy and lovemaking. In other words, lovemaking is not just something considered wholly for the process of generation and procreation, but something that entices and moves and stimulates men and women who, as nature takes its course. The other story we want to talk about is the story of Lefevre. And the story of Lefevre is a rather impressive tale, because we discover that one Lefevre, a dying soldier, is in an inn with his son. Uncle Toby hears that there is a dying soldier in the inn. He hopes the man can recover, but to all extent and purposes, we understand this will not happen. Trim becomes the emissary between Lefevre and Lefevre's son. And there's a rather interesting relationship that develops. I want to talk about it because I had begun this course today by talking about the sensibility and the sentimentality of the novel. I think the Lefevre episode ultimately demonstrates the kindness and compassion that Sterne feels is the singularly important focus of this novel. Even in sexuality, the goodwill of people toward each other becomes a very important theme. And the theme of companionship and just the idea of the response of human beings to each other in misery and in pain and in friendship becomes a very important lesson. So if you turn to volume 6 in the Lefevre episode, I'm going to read a few parts of this just so we get some idea of what of the compassion that we discover in this work. Turn to chapters 12 to 13, the story of Lefevre. Turn to page 292, chapter 6. And drop down to about the penultimate paragraph. He was one evening sitting thus at his supper when the landlord of a little inn in the village came into the parlor with an empty vial in his hand to beg a glass or two of sack. "'Tis for a poor gentleman. I think of the army," said the landlord, "who has been taken ill at my house 4 days ago, and has never held up his head since, or had a desire to taste anything till just now. That he has a fancy for a glass of sack and a thin toast. And I think," says he, taking his hand from his forehead, "it would comfort me if I could neither beg, borrow, or buy such a thing," added the landlord. "I would almost steal it for the poor gentleman, he is so ill. I hope in God he will still mend," continued he. "We are all concerned for him." Uncle Toby says there must be something uncommon in this young man. "Thou art a good-natured soul, I will answer for thee," cried my Uncle Toby, "and thou shalt drink the poor gentleman's health in a glass of sack thyself, and take a couple of bottles with my service, and tell him he is heartily welcome to them, and to a dozen more, if they will do him good." "Though I am persuaded," said my Uncle Toby, as the landlord shut the door, "he is a very compassionate fellow, Trim. Yet I cannot help entertaining a high opinion of his guest, too. There must be something more than common in him, that in so short a time should win so much upon the affections of his host, and of his whole family," added the corporal, "for they are all concerned." "I've quite forgot it truly," said the landlord, coming back into the parlor with the corporal, "but I can ask his son again." "Has he a son with him, then?" said my Uncle Toby. "A boy," replied the landlord, "of about 11 or 12 years of age. But the poor creature has tasted almost as little as his father. He does nothing but mourn and lament him all day." Now what happens, of course, is that Lefevre is proven to be a heroic soldier, and he dies in this inn. His son, who is a noble young man, is taken up by Uncle Toby and Trim, given an education, and at his maturity, he too decides to go to war in honor of his father and to fulfill the career of his father. And the disaster that attends the boy becomes part of this story, as we lament both for the father and for the son. But there's a very interesting element in this whole story which really takes it from just an episode of sentimentality by which we mourn the father and then see the son progress to his end, bearing the sword and bearing the accoutrements of his father. And it is the relationship of Toby and Trim, because Trim, who is Toby's aide, doesn't want to give everything that he should. He feels he is restricted. He doesn't own what Toby owns, and it's only Toby who can go all the way. I want to point out this episode and tell you exactly what happens there. And I thought I had it marked here, but let me just find it. All right, here it is on page 298. Uncle Toby discovers that Trim offered him his house, a room in his house, whatever was in his house. And says Uncle Toby, "You wronged the man. You've fallen short. You should have offered him what was in my house. You should have offered him the whole house." He says, "A sick brother officer should have the best quarters, Trim. And if we had him with us, we would tend and look to him. Thou shouldst, when thou offeredst him whatever was in my house, thou shouldst have offered him my house too." And we get that earlier too. He says, "You offered him subsistence, but he was a poor lieutenant with a son. Thou didst not make an offer to him of my purse, and you should have given him the offer of all that I had. You offered him something. You should have said, everything is yours. You offered him only what's in my house. You should have said, the house is yours." Now, what we have here is an episode of charity so magnanimous, so extraordinary, that you have the absolute bonding of the soldiers in armaments, and then you have the bonding of human beings who need help, and then you have the realization that all the material things in the world are not as important as all that you can give yourself. So that this novel, if you want to call it a novel of sentimentality, far exceeds sentimentality and becomes a lesson in ethical behavior. And the golden rule is exhibited here in such a monumental fashion that few books written afterwards or before could ever fully understand the importance of charity and compassion and human bonds as this book does in this small context in these few lines. To the extent that Tristram Shandy is offers a powerful understanding of the noblest behavior we can understand, it becomes a formidable book in the repertory of novels written. And you can get so much out of it. I've tried in this short time to focus first on the characters we have under study. Then I've attempted to focus on the digressions. We've talked only about a few of the digressions. We haven't discussed Whiskers. We haven't discussed Slockenburgis' tale of Diego and Julia. We haven't discussed clothes and the differences of clothes in scholars. We haven't discussed the story of the King of Bohemia, but you can't discuss it because it's not discussed, right? Trim keeps trying to discuss the King of Bohemia and his 7 castles, and never does it ever appear. Although Stern says through Tristram that he expects to write 40 volumes, and so we can anticipate the story of the King of Bohemia coming later. Now, there is an opportunity for you to experience the 18th century. The next week, March, at the end of this month and early in March, the drama department is going to be presenting She Stoops to Conquer, which is an 18th century play by Oliver Goldsmith. Now, She Stoops to Conquer is going to be done in costume. So you'll get to see the 18th century costume. It's a comedy. It's one of the great comedies of the English stage. You will thoroughly enjoy it. So look in the newspapers, check the dates, and you'll get some of the spirit of Tristram Shandy in Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer. Goldsmith and Laurence Sterne were contemporaries, and you'll get a feel of the country life. You'll get a feel of Walter Shandy's way of living. You'll get a feel of the comic and of the serious in She Stoops to Conquer. You'll find it an experience that will help embellish this play, enrich this play, and this novel, and put this novel in the light in which it should be placed. As you can guess, we can spend a great many more weeks discussing Tristram Shandy, but our schedule asks us to stop at this point, and our next week's discussion will be totally focused on Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. So thank you for joining us this evening. Those of you who are in West Houston, North Houston, and those of you who are watching this on television, our ratings last week said that we surpassed the Super Bowl, but that's because the Super Bowl wasn't on. Thank you for the evening.